My name is Elmarie Wood, and I'm going to read today The Pale Lady by Alexandre Dumas. You may recognize this name from The Three Musketeers or The Count of Monte Cristo, but did you ever realize that Alexandre Dumas wrote horror fiction? He is actually one of the very first authors to put horror fiction down on paper. This story was written in 1849, or at least published in 1849, and marks one of the very beginnings of horror fiction in what was called then Gothic fiction. And you'll see why as we go along. Alexandre Dumas was a black man as well. I don't know if you knew that either. His grandmother was a Haitian slave. So let's dive into this really interesting story called The Pale Lady. It is, aside from being, all these different firsts and being one of the books that sort of mark our history in the genre, it's a really, really good story as well. So settle in. Let's read The Pale Lady by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 1. Among the Carpathians. I am a Pole by birth, a native of Sandomir, a land where legends become articles of faith, and where we believe in our family traditions as firmly as in the gospel. Perhaps more firmly. Not one of our castles but has its specter. Not one of our cottages but owns its familiar spirit. Among rich and poor alike in castle and cot equally, the two principles of good and ill are acknowledged. Sometimes the two are at variance and fight one another against the other. Then are heard mysterious noises in passages, howls in old, half-ruined towers, shaking of walls, so terrible and appalling that cot and castle are both left desolate, while the inhabitants, whether peasants or nobles, fly to the nearest church to seek protection from Holy Cross or blessed relics, the only preservatives effectual against the demons that harass our homes. Moreover, in the same lands, two still more terrible principles still more fierce and implacable are face to face, to wit, tyranny and freedom. In the year 1825, broke out between Russia and Poland one of those death struggles that seem bound to drain the lifeblood of a people to its last drop, as the blood of a particular family is often exhausted. My father and two brothers had risen in revolt against the Tsar and had gone forth to range themselves beneath the flag of Polish independence, so often torn down, so often raised again. One day I learned that my younger brother had been killed. Another day I was told that my elder brother was mortally wounded, lasting after a long 24 hours, during which I listened with terror to the booming of the cannon coming constantly nearer and nearer. I beheld my father ride in with 100 horsemen, all that was left of the 3,000 men under his command. He came to shut himself up in our castle, resolved if need be to perish buried beneath its ruins. Fearless for himself, my father trembled at the fate that threatened me. For him death was only a penalty, for he was firmly resolved never to fail. I'll start that again. For him death was the only penalty, for he was firmly resolved never to fall alive into the hands of the enemies. But for me, slavery, dishonor, shame might be in store. From among the 100 men left him, my father chose 10, summoned the intendant of the estate, handed him all the gold and jewels we possessed, and remembering how at the date of the second partition of Poland, my mother, then scarcely a child, had found unassailable refuge in the monastery of Shiratsu, situated in the heart of the Carpathian Mountains, bade him conduct me thither. The cloister which had sheltered the mother would doubtless be no less hospitable to the daughter. Our farewells were brief, notwithstanding the fond love my father bore me. By tomorrow, in all likelihood, the Russians would be within sight of the castle, so that there was not a moment to lose. Hurriedly, I donned a riding habit, which I was in the habit of wearing when following the hounds with my brothers. The most trusty mount in the stables was saddled for me. My father slipped his own pistols, masterpieces of the Tula gunsmith's art, into my holsters, kissed me, and gave the order to start. That night and the next day, we covered a score of leagues, riding up the banks of one of the nameless rivers that flow from the hills to join the Vistula. This forced march, to begin with, had carried us completely out of the reach of our Russian foes. The last ray of the setting sun, showed us the snowy summits of the Carpathians gleaming through the dusk. Toward the close of the next day, we arrived at the base, and eventually, during the forenoon of the third day, we found ourselves winding along a mountain gorge. Our Carpathian hills differ widely from Western ranges, which are civilized in comparison. All that nature has to show of strange and wild and its grand, it's seen in its completest majesty. I'll say that sentence again. All that nature has to show of strange and wild and grand is seen in its completest majesty. Their storm-beaten peaks are lost in the clouds and shrouded in eternal snow. Their boundless fir woods bend over the burnished mirror of lakes that are more like seas, crystal clear waters which no keel has ever furrowed, no fisherman's net ever disturbed. The human voice is seldom heard in these regions, and then only to raise some rude Moldavian folk song to which the cries of the wild animals reply. Songs and cries blending together to wake only lonely echoes that seem astounded to be roused at all. Mile after mile you traveled beneath the gloomy vaults of the forest, interrupted only by the unexpected marvels which waste reveals to the wayfarer at almost every step, moving his astonishment and admiration. Danger lurks everywhere. Danger compounded of 1,000 varying perils. But there is no time to be afraid. The perils are too sublime to admit of common terror. Now it is the sudden formation of cataracts owing to the melting of the ice, which dashing down from rock to rock unexpectedly overwhelmed the narrow path the traveler is following. A path traced by the sportsman and the game he pursues. Now, it is the falling of the trees undermined by the lapse of time, which tear up their roots from the soil and come crashing down with a sound like that of an earthquake. Now it is the onrush of the hurricane, which unfolds the climber in storm clouds, riven by the darting zigzags of the lightning, writhing and coiling like a serpent. Then after those alpine peaks, after those primeval forests, as you have giant mountains and boundless woods, you next have illimitable steeps, a veritable sea with its waves and tempests, barren, rugged wastes where the eyes wander and lose themselves on the far distant horizon. It is not terror now that seizes the spectator. It is irresistible melancholy, a profound sadness. The look of all the countryside, far as the eye can range, is everlasting the same. You mount only to descend again, slopes that are all alike. This you do 20 times over, searching in vain for a beaten track, still finding yourself thus lost in solitude, amid pathless deserts. Amid pathless deserts, you deem yourself alone with nature, and your melancholy turns to despair. Movement can seem a vain thing that will advance no wit. You will meet with neither village, nor castle, nor cottage, nor smallest trace of human occupation. Only now and again, adding yet another note of sadness to the dreary landscape, a little lake, bare and treeless, without reeds or rushes or brushwood, lying asleep in the bottom of a ravine like another Dead Sea. bars your way with its greenish waters, from which rise your approach a cloud of aquatic birds, uttering long, discordant screams. You make a detour. You climb a hill before you. You go down into another valley. You climb another hill. And this goes on till finally you come to the end of the range of foothills, which grow gradually lower and lower. But now, if you make a bend to the south, the landscape recovers all its grandeur again, and you catch sight of a new range, higher and more picturesque looking, and more inviting. It is all plumed with woods and refreshed by countless watercourses. Shade and moisture give back life to the countryside. The tinkle of the hermit's bell is heard. A caravan is seen winding along the hillside. Finally, under the dying rays of the sinking sun, you sight, looking like a covey of white birds, crouching side by side, the houses of a village grouped together to guard against nocturnal attack. For with life, danger is there again, and it is not now, as in the first range cross, pack of wolves and bears that are to be feared, but hordes of Moldavian robbers. However, we drew near our destination in spite of every difficulty. 10 days consistent traveling had sped without incident, and already we could make out the summit of Mount Pion, a giant a whole head taller than his fellow giants, on whose southern slopes lies the monastery of Shihatsu, to which I was bound. Another 3 days and we stood before the gates. It was the end of August, and the day had been one of the blessing heat. I'll say that once more. It was the end of August, and the day had been one of blessing heat. The relief was intense when toward 4 o'clock we first began to inhale the fresh evening breeze. We had passed by the ruined towers of Nenzansu and were descending upon a plain just opening to view through a gap in the mountains. We could already, from the point we had reached, trace the course of the Bistritza, and note its banks bespeckled with red water poppies and great white campanulas. We were making our way along the brink of a precipice at the foot of which rolled the river, as yet no more than a mountain torrent, our path being barely wide enough to allow our beasts to go two abreast. The guide went first, perched sideways on his horse, singing a native stave to a monotonous air, the words of which I followed with no small interest and pleasure. The singer was composer too. As for the tune, one must be a born mountaineer to appreciate the full its wild melancholy and unsophisticated gloom. The words ran thus: in the marshlands of Stavila, where the fight has oft been sore, see yonder dead man lying. 'Tis no son of Ilaria. 'Tis no son of Ilaria. 'Tis a brigand, fell and fierce, who beguiled a gentle maid, and robbed and burned and slew. A bullet sped like a hurricane and stuck the robber low. In his throat's a yatagan. But for 3 days, oh mystery, beneath the grim and lonely pine, his warm blood wets the ground and strains red the Ogivan. His blue eyes shine no more. Let us away, let none come nigh the swamp where the dead thief lies. 'Tis a vampire. The wild wolf runs howling from the horrid thing. In terror o'er the bare hillside, the vultures swing away. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out, and a musket ball whistled through the air. The song stopped, and the guide rolled mortally wounded down the precipice, while his horse stood shivering on the brink, peering wonderingly into the depths of the abyss into which his master had disappeared. Simultaneously, a great shout was raised, and we saw ourselves surrounded by a band of brigands, some 30 strong. We were entirely surrounded. All seized their weapons, and though caught unawares, my companions, being old soldiers, inured to action, never lost their heads, but returned the fire vigorously. To give an example myself, I grasped a pistol, and seeing how disadvantageous our present position was, cried, "Forward!" and spurred my horse in the direction of the level country. But we had to do with the mountaineers, who sprang lightly from rock to rock like the very demons of the abyss, firing as they leapt and never losing the menacing position they had taken upon our flank. Moreover, our attempts at escape had been foreseen. As a spot where the road widened and the mountain formed a small plain, a young chief awaited us at the head of 10 or a dozen horsemen. On seeing us, they put the horses into a gallop and dashed forward to charge us in front, while the rest who were pursuing us slipped down the mountainsides and surrounded us on every side so as to cut off our retreat completely. The situation was very serious, yet inured as I was from childhood to scenes of strife and bloodshed, I could examine my surroundings without a detail escaping me. Our adversaries were one and all clad in sheepskins and wore enormous round hats garlanded with wild flowers, after the Hungarian fashion. Each carried a long Turkish firepiece. These they brandished in the air after discharging, uttering barbarous shouts the while. In their belts they had, besides a curved saber and a brace of pistols. Their leader was a young man of 22, and with a pale face, long dark eyes, and hair falling in ringlets about his shoulder. His costume consisted of the flowing Moldavian gown, edged with fur and confined at the waist by a scarf of alternate gold and silken stripes. A curved saber flashed in his hands, and 4 pistols glittered in his belt. During the fight, he kept up a string of hoarse, inarticulate cries, which scarcely seemed to belong to human speech, yet they sufficiently expressed his orders, for his men obeyed them implicitly, throwing themselves flat on the ground to avoid our fire, springing up anon to deliver their own, bringing down such as were still capable of defense, finishing off the wounded, and presently turning the fight into a mere butchery. Soon I had seen 2/3 of my defenders fall, one after the other. 4 only were left, who closed about me, never thinking of asking quarter, which they were certain not to receive, hoping one thing only, to sell their lives as dearly as possible. Then the young chief gave a cry more expressive than ever, pointing his saber at us. Doubtless the order was to envelop this final handful in a circle of fire and shoot us down all together, for the long-barreled Moldavian muskets covered us simultaneously. I felt our last hour was come. I raised my eyes and hands to heaven in a last supplication and waited for death. At this supreme moment, I saw another young warrior descend. No, descend is not the word. I should say dash down, leaping from rock to rock. Then he halted, standing on a boulder dominating the whole scene like a statue on its pedestal, and pointing to the field of carnage, pronounced that simple word, "Enough!" All eyes looked up at that voice. Each man appeared ready to obey this new leader. One bandit only raised his gun to his shoulder again and fired. One of our men gave a cry. The ball had broken his left arm. He turned instantly to rush at the man who had wounded him, but before his horse had taken 4 paces forward, a flash shone out above our heads, and the mutinous brigand rolled over, his skull shattered by a bullet. I'll say it once more. He turned instantly to rush the man who had wounded him, but before his horse had taken 4 paces forward, a flash shone out above our heads, and the mutinous brigand rolled over, his skull shattered by a bullet. Such a press of strong and varying emotions had brought me to the end of my strength, and I fell fainting to the ground. When I recovered consciousness, I was lying on the grass, my head supported against the knee of a man whose hand, very white and covered with rings, I could see about my waist. Standing in front of me, with arms crossed and his saber under his arm, was the young Moldavian chieftain who had directed the attack against us. "Kostaki," my protector was saying in French, and with a tone of authority, "You must go this instant and draw off your men and leave me to look after the girl." "Brother, brother," replied the individual to whom these words were addressed, and who appeared to find extreme difficulty in containing himself. "Brother, beware of exhausting my patience. I leave you the castle. Leave the forest to me. Within the castle you are master, but here I am all powerful. Here it would need be one word to compel you to obey me. Kostaki, I am the elder. That is to say, I am master everywhere, and in the castle no less than in the forest, there as well as here. Oh yes, I am of the blood of the Brankovans as much as you. 'Tis royal blood, and it won't be obeyed. I'll say it again. 'Tis royal blood, and is wont to be obeyed. I order, and I must be obeyed." "You order, Gregoriska. Your lackeys, yes, but not my soldiers." "Your soldiers are brigands, Kostaki. Brigands I will have hanged from the battlements of our towers if you do not give me instant obedience." "Well, then order them and see if they obey." Then I felt my supporter draw away his knees and lay my head down softly on a stone. I followed him anxiously with my eyes, and I saw the same young chief who had tumbled, so to speak, from the skies into the middle of the fight, and with whom hitherto I had only been able to catch a glimpse, having swooned at the very instant he had first spoken. He was a young man of 24, of tall stature, with great blue eyes in which was legible a remarkable endowment of resolution and determination. His long flaxen hair, characteristic of the Slav race, fell about his shoulders like the Archangel Michael's, framing his young, fresh cheeks. His lips parted in a disdainful smile, showing a double row of pearls. His gaze was the eagle's confronting the lightning. He was dressed in a kind of tunic of black velvet, a little cap like that which the painter Raphael wears in his portraits, adorned with an eagle's feather on his head. He wore tight breeches and embroidered high boots. Round his waist was a sash containing a hunting knife, while a shoulder belt carried a short double-barreled carbine, the accuracy of which one of the bandits had just been given an opportunity of appreciating. He extended his arm, and the gesture seemed to command the obedience even of his brother. He pronounced a few words in Moldavian, and these words appeared to produce a profound impression on the brigands. Then, using the same language, the young chief spoke in his turn, and I could guess that his words were a mixture of threats and imprecations. But to all his long and fierce harangue, the elder of the two brothers vouchsafed not one word of reply. Vouchsafed, learned a new word today. The brigands bowed before his imperious glance, and at a gesture from him ranged themselves behind him. "Well, so be it, Gregoriska," said Kostaki, returning to the French tongue. "The woman shall not be taken to the cavern. Then she will be mine nonetheless. She is to my taste. I have won her in a fight, and I will have her." And with the words, he darted towards me and lifted me in his arms. "The woman shall be taken to the castle, I repeat, and given into my mother's care, and I mean to see it done," replied my protector. "My horse, bring me my horse," cried Kostaki in Moldavian. A dozen bandits sprang forward to obey and led up the horse to the chief. Gregoriska glanced around him, seized a masterless horse by the bridle, and leapt onto its back without touching the stirrups. Kostaki flung himself into the saddle almost as lightly as his brother, although he still held me in his arms, and dashed off at a gallop. Gregoriska's steed seemed fired with the same spirit, and kept head and flank steady on a level with the head and flank of Kostaki's mount. It was a strange sight, the two horsemen speeding side by side in gloomy silence, never losing one another for a single instant from view, though without seeming to look, giving the reins to their horses, which pursued a wild and desperate course through the woods and amid rocks and precipices. My head was thrown back so as to let me see Gregoriska's fine eyes fixed upon my own. Kostaki, observing this, raised my head, and I could henceforth see only his dark, somber gaze, devouring my face. I dropped my lids, but in vain. Through their shade, I could still feel the same piercing glance penetrating my innocent bosom and lacerating my heart. Then, a strange hallucination took possession of me. I thought I was the lost Lenore of Berger's famous ballad, in the act of being carried off by the spectral horse and horseman. And presently, when I felt we were slackening speed, it was with a feeling of sheer terror I opened my eyes, firmly convinced I should see surrounding me only shattered graveyard crosses and open tombs. What I did behold was hardly less gloomy, to wit, the inner courtyard of a Moldavian castle built in the 14th century. That is the end of chapter 1. We'll start the next reading with chapter 2. Hope you're enjoying the Pale Lady so far.